The border between the United States and Mexico stretches nearly 1,954 miles, around 3,142 kilometers, a line drawn on maps but full of real lives, landscapes, divisions and contested meanings. Over time, what was once a fluid boundary, crossed by workers, families, commerce, travelers, began to take on a different shape: fences, walls, patrols, policies. Something meant to control movement turned the border into a symbol of conflict, immigration, national identity, security and human suffering. In the early 1990s, the United States started to erect physical barriers in some sectors. In one of the first major efforts, a fence was built between the San Diego area and Tijuana, Mexico. This was not, yet, a border wall covering the full boundary. But it represented a shift in how the border was managed: deterrence through physical obstacles rather than porous openness. As years passed, the logic for stronger barriers grew louder. Political pressure, public fear of illegal immigration, concerns about drug smuggling and human trafficking pushed successive administrations to back more border security measures. The idea of a wall, once fringe, gradually edged into mainstream policy debates. By 2006, the U.S. Congress passed the Secure Fence Act of 2006, which authorized the construction of hundreds of miles of fencing along the border. This marked a turning point. The conceptual border wall began building at scale, its concrete and metal replacing the more fluid past. Originally the barriers were concentrated in areas of high traffic and known crossing routes: cities, towns, border crossings. But over time, the coverage, fortification and surveillance expanded. Fences gave way to walls, simple wire to steel panels, occasional patrols to a heavy enforcement apparatus supported by technology. This physical transformation reflected deeper shifts. For many migrants, people leaving hardship, searching for opportunity, crossing for work or family, the border no longer felt. By the time the United States entered the second decade of the 21st century, the border had become a constant point of political attention. Waves of migrants from Central America, many fleeing violence, corruption and economic collapse, began arriving at the southern border in large numbers. Families, women with children, and unaccompanied minors were suddenly at the center of a humanitarian crisis. The border wall, once discussed mainly in terms of security, was now tied to the fate of tens of thousands who arrived with nothing but hope and fear. Along the border towns, shelters became overcrowded. Migrants who had walked for weeks through treacherous terrain waited in lines not knowing if they would be let in, detained or sent back. The system was overwhelmed. Processing centers filled quickly. Humanitarian groups struggled to support migrants stranded between two countries, uncertain where they belonged. U.S. officers found themselves enforcing policies that changed every year, sometimes every month, depending on politics in Washington. During this period, the border wall itself began to symbolize a larger divide in American society. To some, it represented control, sovereignty and a necessary defense against illegal entry. To others, it represented cruelty, fear and the refusal to acknowledge deeper global issues driving migration. The border became less about geography and more about identity: who belongs, who should be allowed in, what America stands for. Politicians began using the border in speeches, campaigns and televised debates. Each new election cycle brought promises to build more, stop more, secure more. The border became a talking point, a rallying cry, a symbol that could stir crowds. It was no longer only about stopping illegal crossings, it was about the image of strength, the reassurance of control in an uncertain world. The actual reality on the ground was more complex than any slogan. Border Patrol agents worked long shifts in harsh conditions. As the border debate intensified, so did the policies surrounding it. In the late 2010s, the U.S. government adopted increasingly strict measures. Zero-tolerance policies meant that anyone crossing without authorization could face criminal charges. Families were separated, often with parents held in one facility and children in another. The media covered these separations extensively, sparking outrage, protests, and legal challenges. The wall was no longer just a physical structure, it had become a symbol of a broader enforcement strategy, one that affected real lives in deeply personal ways. For many migrants, the wall was only one part of the obstacle. The legal system itself was a labyrinth. Seeking asylum required navigating complex laws, long wait times, and an overburdened system. Immigration courts faced massive backlogs, sometimes taking years for a case to be heard. While some were able to gain legal entry, many remained in limbo, living in temporary shelters, traveling repeatedly to border towns, or risking unauthorized crossings. The wall slowed them down, but it could not stop the human desire to pursue safety, family reunification, or opportunity. In certain regions, the wall had unexpected consequences. Smuggling of drugs, weapons, and people did not cease, it simply adapted. Criminal organizations built more tunnels, established new smuggling routes, and innovated in response to barriers. Drones, infrared cameras, and motion sensors were deployed to detect illegal movement, but smugglers constantly tested and circumvented the technology. In many ways, the wall created a game of adaptation. As enforcement became more sophisticated, so did those trying to evade it. The human cost of these strategies remained high. Migrants crossing deserts faced extreme heat, lack of water, and dangerous terrain. Stories of death and disappearance multiplied. Border Patrol reported recovering hundreds of bodies each year, and humanitarian organizations documented. By the early 2020s, the border wall had become more than a physical barrier, it had become a symbol of decades of policy, political conflict, and human struggle. Sections of the wall were completed, repaired, or replaced. In some areas, steel panels towered over the desert floor, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across both land and life. In other areas, gaps remained, stretches of desert, rivers, and mountains where construction was impossible or delayed. The patchwork nature of the wall reflected the complexity of the border itself, part geography, part politics, part human determination. Political debate remained intense. Some leaders called for a complete wall spanning the entire border, arguing that it would secure the nation and prevent illegal immigration and crime. Others emphasized humanitarian concerns, urging reform of immigration policy, investment in legal pathways, and cooperation with Central American nations to address root causes of migration. The conversation extended beyond security, it encompassed ethics, international relations, and the human cost of enforcement. Every action at the border sparked national attention, sometimes global scrutiny, and debates that were as heated as the desert sun. Human stories continued to define the border. Families crossed legally and illegally, often at great risk. Migrants faced dehydration, exposure, exploitation by smugglers, and the threat of detention. Yet they persisted, motivated by the hope of work, safety, or reuniting with loved ones. Nonprofits, volunteers, and local residents intervened whenever possible, providing water, food, medical aid, and shelter. Their efforts highlighted a tension that defined the border: enforcement versus compassion, security versus humanity. Meanwhile, attempts to circumvent the wall continued. Smugglers dug tunnels, exploited gaps, and tested the limits of surveillance. Technology was deployed to detect movement, from drones and sensors to infrared cameras.